Welcome to Wave on Wave, the podcast exploring the cutting edge of defense technology. Our mission is to explore the role of AI and advanced technology to dominate in the electromagnetic spectrum, on land, at sea, in the air, and out in space. Let's cut through the noise and get started.
Hey everybody, this is Kevin and Logan coming back at you for the next episode. Really excited to jump in today. The topic today is going to be, EW tactics or electronic warfare tactics. It's just been really, swirling around my brain a lot on kind of what's been happening kind of across the globe in electronic warfare and in Ukraine and in Israel, and really kind of this how this whole domain is changing just like day by day. And so we're going to dig into a little bit about kind of some definitions of what we think electronic warfare is, of what spectrum dominance is, coming off the heels of the annual, the AUSA conference, which is an annual event that the Army runs. There's probably 40,000 people there, bunch of vendors, bunch of soldiers, bunch of warfighters, all trying to figure out what's the next technology and the next tactics for really the next conflict that the Army is going to engage in. So I'll pass it over to Logan real quick to kind of get his thoughts on what he saw at AUSA and really kind of the focus of AUSA this year from his perspective. What's up, Logan?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so the AUSA was a great show this year. So Association of the United States Army, big show every year. I've been the last couple of years, and it's definitely growing. It gets bigger every year. There was definite themes that we saw throughout the conference, both from a kind of panel perspective with senior leaders briefing about different things, but then also from a technology demonstration perspective. What technologies were there and what were those themes? A couple themes that surfaced pretty quickly. The big ones that we saw were unmanned systems. I think unmanned systems was probably tied for number one with what was being talked about. Every big vendor there had some type of autonomous system, whether it's a ground vehicle or a drone. And so that was very much kind of one of the big forward themes for the conference. And it's a forward theme for everyone. So you mentioned what's going on in Ukraine and Israel. And so I think we're quickly seeing how you can amass forces with robotics, whether that's an unmanned system or even a human-driven system, but and how those systems work together, so that human machine interface and how those systems team. Everybody's extremely focused on that. So that was one of the big themes. And then obviously, near and dear to our hearts, which we feel also is kind of layered in the autonomous system space, but the spectrum dominance message that was the thread that was pulled across, everything at AUSA as well. So one of the major themes. And it was interesting as, you and I both, and then some other folks on the team was kind of speaking with industry leaders and technology providers on their thoughts on spectrum dominance and what that means. There's a lot of senior leaders that spoke about it. Everyone tends to have their own definition of what that is. And I think that you usually have that with kind of emerging areas. And it's very clear that everyone kind of has their own definition of spectrum dominance. And kind of depending on where you come from, you're likely going to have a different definition just based on what you think is most important to you and your mission as a warfighter. So if you're an infantry leader, you're going to have probably a different definition of spectrum dominance than somebody that's in an aircraft or somebody that's responsible for armor pieces or things like that across the battlefield. It's super interesting to hear what everyone thinks and kind of where they think is where the most critical area is in spectrum dominance, but how we see it as a spectrum dominance oriented organization and building technology to enable spectrum dominance is spectrum dominance is very wide. And so how Logan's kind of definition and how I think that spectrum dominance plays in the defense space is one, there's a kind of an offensive and a defensive side to spectrum dominance. One being the offensive side, where you want to deny the adversary the ability to have freedom and maneuver in the spectrum. So, whether that's from a communications perspective, being able to control their autonomous systems, being able to have, reach back capability from, a forward position, All of that is kind of offensive, the offensive side of spectrum dominance. So how do we deny the adversary that capability? And then from a defensive perspective, it's kind of the other 50% of spectrum dominance. And I think, offense always tends to overpower the defense in the conversation, but the defensive side is just as important. And so the defense kind of encompasses understanding what the adversary looks like in the spectrum, but also what the friendly forces look like in the spectrum, and being able to detect both sides. So detecting what we look like, and then being able to kind of promote any type of anomalies or emissions that may affect the friendly force, but then also trying to detect to enable targeting of an adversary. And so so spectrum dominance kind of pulls both of those sides together, and leads you to the definition of being able to see yourself, see the adversary, and then deny the adversary freedom of maneuver in the spectrum while enabling freedom of maneuver for the friendly force. So that's it kind of encompasses the overall definition. But that theme, so spectrum dominance and kind of the autonomous system space, was definitely kind of the leading themes for AUSA. And I mean, my opinion on that. I think they're both kind of interwoven, and I think sometimes senior leaders kind of see those two things as two separate kind of verticals or domains, and they're actually kind of layered. And so you can't, if you don't have spectrum dominance, you're going to struggle with employment of autonomous systems. And I think coming together and kind of peeling that onion when it comes to those things is important, and it's important for people to understand.
Yeah, no doubt. I think in my 21-year long career, there was a couple. I wasn't electronic warfare officer, but I think all of us that fought in the GWAT war, in the 2004 all the way through 2012, 13, 14, all of us kind of knew the importance of electronic warfare really in the IED fight. I was actually, 2 weeks ago, I was actually up at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and actually met an engineer that built the first ICE system. And then he built the next Duke system. And that was like the center of gravity for everyone trying to do IED defeat, was in, building these systems that were essentially, jamming systems that would protect, various ranges of all these different terrorist groups that were trying to kill U.S. service members through IEDs. And the way they would initiate the IED was really through a remote control sensor. And these systems that were on every single Humvee would essentially block the signal from actually detonating around the Humvee. And so I actually met this guy, which was fantastic. And I told him, I said, hey, when in 2005 we were getting blown up with IEDs left and right, and there was multiple times where we drove by an IED and it detonated about 30 yards from our Humvee and saved the lives of multiple of my soldiers. And I think that really kind of dominated a lot of the conversation about electronic warfare. When you start talking about IEDs, and I think we all kind of get that tactic. We all understand kind of the IED fight, but as electronic warfare is morphing, on a week to week basis. Now it's all about drones, right? Logan's background is in drones, and he knows, autonomous systems really well. And, I think the world, is kind of, morphing into this drone on drone fight, with electronic warfare really being, the underbelly, the linchpin to actually operating all these drones into this new modern battlefield. And I think, some of our leaders don't understand that. They have their bias in kind of the GWAT fight and IEDs and how electronic warfare played, but that's really the next evolution, and we're seeing it kind of play out today.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that coming to the realization that the robotic systems or the autonomous systems that are going to be employed on the next battlefield. I mean, we're seeing it play today in these various theaters around the world, but the next fight the next large scale combat operation that we would be a part of, that those systems are going to dominate the battle space. So, in the past you had, various assets that you would use to initiate different things, whether that's softening an objective before people enter an area and enter an objective, or collection capabilities that would be out in front of a forward line of troops. But if you kind of think about the way that the next fight will play, there's going to be another kind of echelon that's going to be employed ahead of your forward line of troops. That is essentially your movement to contact. So all those battle drills that you rehearsed early on in a lot of our careers as a warfighter, those will be. I wouldn't say they're not going to replace a lot of those tactics, techniques, and procedures that we learned as a warfighter, but it's going to be kind of that forward, the first wave. Not to pun on the podcast here, but the first wave that will essentially be in that large scale combat operation is going to be autonomous. So, and we're seeing it play out, and it's only getting bigger. And so, to be able to control and team a lot of these vehicles and a lot of these systems, you're going to have dominance of the spectrum. So it's only going to be as good as that freedom of maneuver you have in the spectrum, as I mentioned earlier. So that's where that spectrum dominance definition is extremely important, and everyone needs to understand that. So not only will electronic warfare have effects on personnel, because it's still going to jam communications and it's still going to disrupt other things that we're doing with electronics behind that forward line of troops, but it's also going to affect everything that's happening from that initial autonomous wave that will likely occur in the next large scale combat operation.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, cool. So I think maybe to kind of start this is, I think, defining like what is spectrum dominance, right? I think everybody, like you said, everybody comes at this with a little bit different of a stance. We get it. Offense, okay, defense, but like how would you define it?
Well, I think, it's going back to the whole having freedom of maneuver when it comes to anything that's connected. So if you want to boil it down to like the lowest level here, me being able to talk to you when you're 100 meters away or 100 kilometers away requires understanding and dominance of that communication pipe between my radio, my computer, my system to your radio, your computer, your system. So how do those two things talk to each other? Well, currently communications either flows. There's several different ways that the communication can flow from my device to your device, but there's always going to be a period of time where that communication signal travels through the air. And so, I'm not going to have likely, in a kind of a rapid deployment, I'm not going to have a hard line connection where I'm at from 100 kilometers away to your location. So there's not going to be a cable that attaches to you, especially if you're looking at the Pacific theater. There's a lot of small islands and atolls that are spread out throughout that theater, and having a hard line connection is going to be relatively impossible in the short run. So maybe eventually, after you kind of harden the area and array your forces, and you can kind of dig in a little bit, then you may be able to have hard line connections. But initially, a lot of that communication is going to happen over the air. And so that's whether you're, like I said, whether we're communicating person to person, person to system, system to system, a lot of that communication is going to happen over the air. So how do you protect, how do you dominate and have freedom of maneuver with your communications between those various devices? That in my that's kind of a simple, I feel like, definition for people to understand is like, that's where having dominance of the spectrum, and that goes both offensive and defensive. So if you're using a system to do something offensive, you gotta be able to have connection to those devices, to those systems. And then the defensive perspective, you gotta have the same thing. You gotta be able to shoot, move, and communicate. And so now the way we shoot, it's leaning towards a lot of autonomous systems. How do we move? Well, we're starting to employ a lot of autonomous systems to move in the battle space. And how do we communicate? Well, again, signals going across the air. And so having kind of dominance and being able to control that, be aware of what's happening if we're not able to communicate. So is there something that's interfering or disrupting my communications, or is it nefarious or not? Is it something that I'm emitting that's causing interruption with our connection, or is it something the adversary is doing to disrupt our communication? Then identifying that and then being able to mitigate it. And doing that quickly, so we don't lose that third leg of the stool there, which is the communicate portion, which is likely one of the most important. So you can shoot and move all day, but if you can't communicate, you might not know where you're moving to or who you're shooting at. So you got to
Mm-hmm.
that communication leg of the stool is an important one.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the electronic warfare community kind of talks about, electronic attack, electronic protection, and then electronic support really are kind of like the three tasks that are, doctrinal to the Army. I think you're kind of you're describing those different things, right? Like, I think a lot of people, understand the protection side, right? What we have to protect, the shoot, move, and communicate. We have to be, all of our comms need to be effective and deliver at the time they need to be delivered. But like this jamming, jamming is a huge problem. That's essentially, an attack that the adversary is pushing on us, that is jamming different things. We haven't really talked too much about like deception or spoofing, but those are also, critical aspects of kind of the electronic warfare kind of cat and mouse game. And then the other big one that, electronic warfare kind of, is really, I think, hugely important, is kind of the reconnaissance aspect of how does electronic warfare really start to play inside of understanding what the adversary is doing, what potentially are they, what kind of frequencies are they on, how are they employing their comm systems. But all these things together kind of add to the complexity, but also have to be really well understood by the maneuver commander now. Previously, just, hey, turn on your IED jamming system and let it do its thing, right? And that was kind of old school legacy. Now there's just so many different dynamics that every time you maneuver, like you said, shoot, move, communicate, every time you do one of those tasks, there's an electronic warfare aspect of that, of like, how do I actually attack in coordination with the defense? And I think all of these things kind of roll up in understanding, the landscape, the spectrum, really the analysis of these different things, and then being able to kind of tee up decisions for commanders, at the right times, right? We're all very linear thinkers in the military, and there's different things you do at certain times of a battle, and this is maybe the most critical part of really those different troop leading procedures.
Yeah, no, that's definitely where the evolution, I think, is came in, is that thought process where it's like, okay, I got these big exquisite systems, let's turn them on, let's let them do their thing, and now it's the minute you turn something on, it is emitting a signature, so it is emitting a signal that can be detected, and across the GWAT, the adversary in that scenario likely didn't have, and they didn't have the capability to be able to detect those emissions, so we could turn whatever we wanted on, whether it was a generator to run a big drash setup, or something on a fob somewhere, or on a vehicle forward. It didn't really matter. Like, you could turn whatever you wanted on to add layers and layers and layers of protection from those different things. But now all of those different things you want to turn on, the minute they're on, they're able to be recognized and targeted from afar. So that whole that's where I think there's a lot of emphasis now also being put on long range precision fires. And where that precision comes into those scenarios is, it used to be very much driven with imagery and other types of assets that we had available to be able to get precise coordinates for targeting. Well, a lot of that is not going to be as available either, because it's going to be denied. So what's another way that you can do long range precision fires? Well, let's utilize the spectrum, because everybody that has something is emitting something. So now you can utilize that aspect of electronic warfare to be able to do precision fires as well. So again, going along with what you said, it's just it's a paradigm shift, really based on sophistication of the adversary.
Yeah, I think I went to Ranger school. I know your background's in the infantry as well, and had that Ranger experience. And I think, as we start to think about kind of old school and the new school kind of combining together, I think our tactics they're still grounded in the basics, right? They're still grounded in troop leading procedures, still grounded in techniques, tactics, and procedures. They're grounded in that. However, the sophistication of the technology is now rapidly evolving to, now you got to think about squads and platoons having hyper enabled weapon systems that are emitting different capabilities. You think about like an L-shaped ambush, right? That's kind of classically trained from ROTC, West Point cadets, all the way through, the Ranger Regiment today. That is a classically trained, how does EW really start to change that classically trained tactic? And how could we reimagine, these different weapon systems in that battle drill, where now you're having to look for, hey, should we execute this L-shaped ambush if they have a hypersonic, tactical weapon, or if they have actually, EW gear that can sense where we are based off our own communication signals. That L-shaped ambush is going to fail miserably, because you're now going to have call for fire on top of your head, and there's going to be artillery rounds kind of raining in as you prep for that L-shaped ambush, right? I think that whole approach is going to rapidly change.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, because that, like you said, it's a classic kind of battle drill. And the minutes, and this L-shaped ambush is just one example. You're setting up support by fire and your assault team in an L shape, on a bend in a road somewhere, and likely those guys have different radios and different things that they're using to communicate, which are emitting. And so the minute that I see a formation in the spectrum that looks like an L shape, that's going to be an L-shaped ambush. So I know that as an adversary, not to send my people down that road or to soften that objective before I get there via some type of indirect fire. And same thing we're seeing with command posts. A lot of people are talking about the command posts of the future, because your typical legacy command post is full of equipment, full of gear, full of things that emit that can be targeted. So what does that command post look like in the spectrum, and how do we change that to disrupt what the enemy sees? Same thing with like a water crossing. That's another big one. It takes a lot of vehicles and different types of equipment to do a hasty water crossing. So setting up some type of bridge with engineers to be able to pull heavy weapons across a waterway that looks a certain way in the spectrum. And so just like it looks a certain way from satellite imagery, we have to kind of start thinking about it that way. Is if you are reconning an area, what does that look like in the spectrum? If you're doing another type of operation, what does that look like in the spectrum? Just like it would from the air, whether it's some type of fixed wing asset or satellite imagery. And I think that we were able to use a lot of techniques to help with that too. Where we did a lot of operations where we always say we own the night, because we have the ability to see at night with night vision capabilities and things like that. We're able to do things when maybe there's different weather patterns where there's cloud cover, so you might not be able to see us from a high altitude aircraft or a satellite, but the spectrum doesn't care. Spectrum doesn't care what time of day it is or whether there's cloud cover. So
Yeah.
I think that's that other complexity, the other variable that's getting thrown in a lot of these equations that we have to make sure as a fighting force that we're thinking through.
Yeah. It was funny, this week, we got to talk to a ton of people at AUSA, from, the U.S. Army, Norwegian Army, Ukrainian Army. We got to talk to a range of different people. One of the stories that really stuck out to me, I know you've served in Ukraine before. You really know the terrain. But somebody asked, they said, how does the war change during the winter months, and what does the battlefield kind of feel like out there? What do the tactics change? And when that question was asked, I was kind of like, that's not even a very interesting question at all. But then if you've been there and you've been on the ground and you understand the real grit of the battle space, that terrain turns into about 2 feet of mud during the winter months, and nobody can maneuver like in how we perceive maneuvering around the battlefield. You have your Humvees, you have your tanks, you have your Bradleys, you have all these different things that can maneuver, but in 2 feet of mud kind of all across the battle space, you're really hunkered down. There's not a lot of foot traffic. There's definitely not a lot of tracked vehicles or even wheeled vehicles that are maneuvering, and really the only thing that's maneuvering is drones, right? So the drone on drone warfare drastically changes in 2 feet of mud, and really that's really the eyes and ears of each sensor and each soldier is that drone. And so as we think about EW on drones, how do we deploy these drones? How do we sense the environment? How do we, be offensive and defense with electronic warfare? And how does this kind of completely change really 4 to 5 months of the year, and how does it kind of change as it rapidly ramps up into the spring and summer when fighting increases? So I thought that was a really interesting question and really interesting answer on how this is evolving very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's one of those other variables that kind of gets thrown into the battle space depending on your region of the world. And I think being able to array your forces in a way that sets yourself up for success before a rainy season starts, so you kind of understand the assets you have available, array them in a way that sets you up for success during that variable that's thrown into play. So when the rainy season starts and you have less ability to maneuver with traditional and conventional vehicles and other assets you have, how do you array yourself so that you can use new assets that are available to you, like the drone and other types of aerial assets that you may have at your disposal, in preparation for that time for the ground to refreeze, which will happen. It gets very cold in Ukraine, so likely there's a period of time where that rain occurs, where you have that mud, and then where there's not a lot of movement from the ground, and everything's kind of taken to the air until that ground freezes, and then the maneuverability capability is now re-enabled. And so I think, it was very interesting kind of scenarios that we heard from different folks that have been there in real time, and it's kind of scary. It's a scary thing to think through, because it's something that your traditional warfighter has likely never seen. There's groups in the defense world that have likely been there and have seen it in different parts of the world, but this is new for the majority of the fighting force.
Yeah. So as we think about that, you think the U.S. military is prepped to handle this next, important aspect of EW? I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on, right? But you think we're prepared? I think that's a kind of a loaded question, I guess, because you have to look at a kind of across the joint force, right? You look at the Army. I'm sorry, you look at the Navy, you look at the Air Force, and comparatively to the Army, I think the Navy and the Air Force essentially bolt on electronic warfare kind of straight on the platforms. They're very platform centric forces. As you look at the Army coming off the heels of AUSA, you think we're prepped to handle the next wave of electronic warfare challenges?
I would say from a narrative perspective, a lot of people are saying the right things. I think but words only mean so much. So I think that having I think the right idea is there. I think we're still kind of stuck in the mindset where we're doubling down on traditional exquisite type systems that are employed in one place that cover a larger area, versus decentralizing a lot of the technology to give smaller units the ability to maneuver with those capabilities organic to their smaller formations. And I think that's where there's not a lot of focus. There's a little bit of focus being put on it, and I'm not as familiar with some of the other services, but I think that that's got to be a critical aspect to the future posture for electronic warfare, is kind of a decentralized approach. We still need those larger, exquisite systems. They're going to be important, especially when it comes to like a joint fight. Your JSA and some of these areas that are behind the forward line of troops are going to need large protection and from EW, and so those larger systems are going to be critical. But again, having smaller systems that are distributed and decentralized from those larger systems are going to be important, because of kind of the disparate fight. As I mentioned, if we look at the Pacific region, it's not going to be a division that's going to be fighting in one area. It's going to be just like it was in the Pacific in World War II. You're going to have people spread out across island chains, and so having a full division and brigade-sized elements that are maneuvering in unison is not going to be the case. So you have to invest in this decentralized approach in order to maintain that dominance of the spectrum. And so I think that the thought is there. I would say, from my perspective, my opinion, I don't know if the investment is there. I think it's probably coming, but I think it probably needs to come a little faster because getting the adoption of some of these systems takes time. It's years, and then getting people trained on it and then allowing them to be proficient in employing them also takes a lot of time. So kind of the time is now for that
Yeah.
to occur to ensure that we have all of those kind of second and third order effects covered prior to prior to the H hour, whenever that happens, if it ever happens, that next fight, we need to be prepared and need to be fully equipped to take on that fight.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. I think, maybe a different slant on that, but I think it's really, how do we train our people to really understand electronic warfare, right? Like, you ask 100, Army soldiers, Army officers, how many know the ins and outs of the spectrum dominance, right? Probably five, maybe less, right? And I think, it's drilled in everybody about, shoot, move, communicate. When they think communicate, they think picking up a radio and talking to somebody, right? That's about the extent of communication, right? How to use proper protocols when you're talking on a radio. That's the only thing that people are trained on. They don't understand, the power frequencies. They don't understand bandwidths. They don't understand sample rates. They don't understand all these different very advanced topics when you start talking about the spectrum, what rides on certain bands, what changes, what's pulsing, what's not, I think it'd be shocking to see the amount of education of the spectrum from our just our human capital. And I think if building technology can support that and get them kind of over that first hurdle of understanding and applying electronic warfare, I think that's really the goal. No one's going to be, we can't have EW experts everywhere, but I think if we can get them trained in understanding and thinking about it and adding that part of their domain expertise, I think not just the physical terrain, but the spectrum terrain, really understanding that is a critical component. And hopefully, as this matures and technology is kind of rolled out, it's continually drilled and it's continually part of the NTC rotations, the JRTC rotations. Everyone's getting kind of a 10-level training on EW.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more.
All right, I think maybe the last topic, right? So we talked a lot about EW, a lot about tactics, a lot about how it's a major theme at AUSA this year. I think I get really excited about the technology. I know you do too. As AI kind of comes on, is kind of layered onto all these different military functions. Where do you see kind of AI handling various aspects of this, really complex domain?
So I think there's several areas, and I think the one fear when you talk to anyone that's currently serving about AI is they feel like they don't have control of something if AI is inserted into that kind of value chain, and I think that's kind of the thing we need to kind of overcome as a fighting force, as a society. Is where, especially in defense, there's always going to still be a need for the human to be in that loop, but I think there's also a need to automate some of these processes, especially when there's a large learning curve. So the spectrum being, like you said, very complex. If you're not classically trained in electronic warfare or physics or something like that, you're not going to necessarily understand what you see power somewhere in the spectrum, what that means. And so how do you automate that in a way where it's not taking decision ability away from a human, but it's just enabling them or empowering them to make a better decision? So I think there's a process there where you insert AI into some of these different processes and procedures, but you have to, in parallel, make them comfortable with the information that they're being provided, so they feel comfortable to make that decision based off what they've been given. And I think that's that leap we need to make. We need to make sure that we're hyper enabling, as people like to say now, that warfighter to get information faster, to make a decision faster, because the pace of the fight is also going to change. That's the other thing that's rapidly evolving from GWAT time, is the pace of that fight is going to be a lot faster. And so that means we need to enable that decision-making loop to be faster. And so how do we do that? Well, you add artificial intelligence into the loop. not to make the decision for them, but to provide them the best information possible to make the best decision possible in a very rapid manner.
Yep. I get it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that hyper enable that's definitely a buzzword that's floating around everywhere. It's like you can't just be enabled today; you have to be hyper enabled, right? And I think that's it, and I think there's kind of as tech evolves and starts to outpace the ability for people to understand it and collect it and manage it. And I think the big word that you didn't say, but I think you were hinting around it, was really trust, right? And I think the Army has always been a crawl, walk, run Army. You can't just give a piece of kit to somebody and say, go fight today. They've got to, build up that muscle memory and that trust. And I think, AI for electronic warfare, but I think AI for anything else is really all about trust and building that repeatability and into the equation. The Army is all about people. Army is all about culture and values and character and the team, right? Whether you're a brigade combat team, you're a division team, you're a squad team, you're an actual team, all of that relies on trust. And I think with AI and technology, it's all about building that repetition into the training cycle, into the deploy cycle, and then into the reset cycle of how do we keep working with the teams to really build that in.
Yeah, I think there's a fine line there too. I chuckled when I say hyper enabled, but because it's not false and it's a good term, but there's a fine line between oversaturating information to one person, and I think that's the other kind of aspect that AI does. There's more information available than there's ever been, and so how do you boil all that down to give that information to the warfighter to make the best decision? And if they have to make a fast decision, they can't be inundated with an abundance of information. So it's got to be able to distill down the stuff that they need to know at that period of time. So they have, two or three things to decide between versus 1,000 things, because then if you over hyper enable them, then that is not helpful either. So there's a fine line there with getting the information that people need to know fast, but not inundating them with so much information that it stifles the decision-making process even more.
Yeah, just like the story we heard about the 3-star Marine general at 29 Palms. It's like he's just inundated with all this information, all these blobs of color on a map, right? Everybody thinks you put a map down, you put a bunch of blobs on it, someone's going to understand what that means. But in reality, like, there's information overload, and like you can quickly get overwhelmed in the EW space because all the information that's flying at you, and it's just pummeling you because it just doesn't stop, right? Wave on wave, right? It just keeps coming, and there's no ability to kind of suss that out and then orient to time, place, and then predictability of how confident that decision is going to be on the battlefield. And I think that's really the impact of where AI can really support if done kind of in stride with the decision maker.
I agree.
Cool. All right, I think we're about out of time. This has been a fantastic discussion on EW tactics. I think something I didn't talk about before we started this podcast, but we're going to actually kind of roll out a couple of these different EW tactics. We're going to bring a couple guests on to kind of like give us their background and understanding of how they see EW tactics play out. And so stay tuned for that. We'll probably do like 3 or 4 different episodes on this EW tactics topic, and then we'll kind of roll to something else. But really excited to chat, Logan. This is fantastic. Looking forward to next episode.
Sounds great. Thanks, Kevin.